Amid the grandeur of the Lydian palace, King Alyattes sat upon his throne. The kingdom was preparing for a long war against Media. Generals were busy mapping out strategies. Temple priests read the signs of the heavens, and the people awaited a decisive command. But that day, the king summoned someone who was neither a noble, a commander, nor a priest. His name was Thales of Miletus, a philosopher and foreign scholar. The nobles whispered in surprise, "Why would the king listen to a common man?" Thales carried no sword and commanded no army. All he brought was a papyrus scroll, filled with notes about the sky and how to read nature through logic. King Alyattes saw something in Thales that his advisors did not possess. A different way of thinking. In a world ruled by war and superstition, the voice of a philosopher could sound strange. But sometimes it's exactly the voice that matters most. Thales did not come to speak of military tactics. He came to speak of the sky and of time. He warned the king that during the great battle that was being planned, a rare celestial event would occur, a solar eclipse. For ancient peoples, an eclipse was a sign of divine wrath. If Lydia's army fought on that day, fear could shatter their morale faster than any enemy spear. The king listened in silence. The generals sneered. "How can stars decide a war?" One of them mocked. But Thales did not reply with myths. He laid out his calculations, dates and eclipse cycles based on Babylonian records. His knowledge provided answers even the priests could not give. The king began to realize, knowledge can be sharper than any sword. That night, the royal council chamber was tense. Thales stood in the center of the great stone hall, surrounded by priests, generals, and nobles. Torchlight danced along the walls, casting long shadows, emphasizing the divide between reason and belief. The priests glared. "A great decision must come from the will of the gods, not from counting stars," one of them boomed. Some nobles nodded in agreement. It was hard to accept that a foreigner dared to speak against tradition. But Thales stood firm. He unrolled his papyrus and pointed to his astronomical records from Babylon. He showed the positions of the stars, explained orbital patterns and time cycles. Every statement was not opinion. It was observation and logic. King Alyattes listened closely, comparing Thales's calculations with the priest's prophecies. The priest spoke of divine anger. Thales spoke of natural cycles. The priests invoked fear. Thales offered certainty. The debate lasted long. But slowly, the generals began to think, if Thales was right, they could avoid chaos on the battlefield. For the first time in Lydian history, the voice of reason stood side by side with the voice of the temple. Alyattes began to see that true power is not only about ruling, but about listening to the right voice, even if it comes from outside palace walls. Days after that heated council, a monumental decision was made. King Alyattes stood on the palace balcony, looking down at his army preparing for war. In his hand was not a sword, but Thales' report on the time of the solar eclipse. The generals protested. Delaying the war will give the enemy time to fortify their defenses. They cried. The priests were no less outraged. This is an insult to the god of war. But the king did not waver. He held something they did not: certainty. "It is better to delay war than to challenge the heavens," he said firmly. That decision changed the course of history. On the day of the eclipse, the sun darkened at midday. The Median army, ready for battle, panicked. They saw the eclipse as a curse. Morale crumbled. Their lines broke. The battle never happened. Lydia's army was spared without swinging a single sword. This became the first recorded moment in history when science altered the outcome of war. The generals who had mocked Thales began to respect him. Even the priests had to admit that logic held undeniable power. King Alyattes gazed at Thales with quiet satisfaction, not because he bowed to a philosopher, but because he made a decision based on knowledge, not fear. In the ancient world, many kings loved to speak, but few knew when to listen. Alyattes was the exception. Thales had brought no army, no treasure, only a way of thinking. By predicting the eclipse, he saved thousands of soldiers, prevented a war, and preserved the stability of Lydia. All of it accomplished not with magic, but with calculation and intellect. The king began to realize that knowledge is an invisible ally, yet a mighty one. He invited Thales more often to the strategy room. Their discussions no longer focused only on the heavens, but also on harvest seasons, wind directions, trade routes, and even diplomatic policies. For many nobles, this was a great shift. But for Alyattes, it was a step toward a smarter reign. He understood that a kingdom relying only on swords would fall quickly, but a kingdom built on knowledge could endure far longer. After that bloodless victory, Thales' status in Lydia changed drastically. From a foreign philosopher, he became royal advisor. The king gave him access to maps, logistics, and weather records, privileges no outsider had ever received. Thales began applying practical science to strengthen the kingdom. He predicted crop and harvest seasons by observing the stars. He calculated river flow to optimize food distribution. He devised methods to determine direction and distance using the sun's shadow. The generals slowly learned from him. The priests, though reluctant, realized that faith and knowledge could coexist. Alyattes understood a crucial truth. Great power is not built on swords alone, but on precise knowledge. The Lydian palace became a place where throne and logic shared the same table. Time passed and Thales' influence grew. Nobles who once nodded blindly at orders began to ask questions. Priests who had once rejected his words now debated the meaning of the heavens. In many ancient kingdoms, questions were considered threats, but in Lydia the king let them flourish. Thales became a catalyst of change. He did not teach people to believe him, but to seek answers themselves. Alyattes realized that a strong kingdom is not just one with a mighty army, but one whose people can think. This change was small but monumental. Lydia became one of the most stable kingdoms of its time, not only because of wealth, but because of a shift in mindset. The story of the Lydian king who listened to a philosopher spread quickly. Envoys from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Media came not to fight, but to learn. This was unprecedented in the ancient world. Usually only kings, priests, or generals commanded the stage, but now a thinker with no rank, Thales, stood at the center of attention. He explained that the sky was not a curse, but a language of nature that anyone could learn. Sailors used his methods to navigate. Farmers learned to time their crops. Merchants calculated their voyages. Thales' influence moved beyond palace walls, reaching ports, markets, and ships. Many kings wanted to speak, but only a few knew when to listen. Alyattes was one of them. He did not see Thales as a threat to his throne. He saw him as a mirror, someone who could say what the flattering courtiers never would. Thales sought no power, and perhaps that was why his words mattered even more. King Alyattes proved that a great ruler is not the loudest voice, but the wisest ear. And in a harsh ancient world, such decisions were rare. Centuries later, historians wrote about Alyattes and Thales, not as two men from different classes, but as two figures who shaped history together. Thales is remembered as the first philosopher to alter a political decision through science. Alyattes is remembered as the king wise enough to listen to a thinker, not just swords and prayers. This story became a lesson throughout the ancient world, that a single decision to listen to the truth can save thousands of lives, change the course of war, and rewrite a nation's destiny. One brilliant idea is stronger than 1,000 soldiers,